Good evening. It's 6:28. I'd normally wait till 6:30 on the dot, but since we have a full room, which I'm delighted to see, I guess we may as well begin. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Museum of the City of New York and the Waterfront Alliance, for promoting this event as well. To talk about this new book by our guest, Kurt Schlichting, Waterfront Manhattan, From Henry Hudson to the High Line. There are flyers at the door, if you notice on the way in, from the publisher with a discount for the book you can purchase on sale. A book which is surprisingly the first book to do the entire history of the waterfront.
I think it might be.
And provides and argues that it's the waterfront that provides an ideal vantage, and indeed the ideal vantage, from which to understand New York City's history, if we are to understand why New York City became so important to the nation, commercially and in so many other respects. By making the waterfront the center of historical focus instead of the periphery, Professor Schlichting forces us to remember why the Dutch chose this island in the first place. In other words, the critical role that New York's great harbor played in the outside development of the city. And I'm not going to say any more because I don't want to step on the toes of the conversation we're going to have. But for this reason, I'm happy I would join historian Tyler Anbader, who writes on the jacket that the book probably explains better than any other volume why New York became the great metropolis it became. I also don't know of another book which describes the evolution of the waterfront with as much richness as scope. Deftly weaving census rolls, shipping timetables, maps, government reports into a complex but somehow eminently readable narrative about Manhattan's shoreline, which unfolds across time and space, shifting between local, national, and global. So I encourage you all to read it. Kurt Schlichting is the E. Gerald Corrigan Chair in the Humanities and Social Sciences at Fairfield University and a professor of sociology and anthropology there. He's the author of Grand Central Terminal, Railroads, Architecture, and Engineering in New York, for which he received the 2002 Best Professional Scholarly Book in Architecture and Urbanism from the Association of American Publishers. That book was also the basis of Grand Central, a history series produced by the American Experience on PBS, and the award-winning filmmaker Michael Epstein, for which Schlichting served as an on-screen interviewee and as an academic advisor. He followed that text with a biography of William J. Wilgus, Grand Central's chief engineer, which Clifton Hood, the distinguished historian, called, quote, the single best analysis we have of freight transportation in an early 20th century US city. So we are very delighted to have Kurt Schlichting with us here tonight. And we are equally grateful for our discussant, Elizabeth Albert, Associate Professor of Art and Design at St. John's University and the author and editor of Silent Beaches, Untold Stories, which explores more than 600 miles of New York City's coastline through the multidisciplinary lens of historical narrative, archival photography, and contemporary art. The culmination of 6 years of research, image collection, photography, and writing, the project originally was realized in the form of a multimedia exhibition curated by Albert for St. John's University, then expanded into a book published in 2016, features the work of internationally known and notable contemporary artists and writers such as Joel Meyerowitz, Mary Mattingly, Carrie Mae Weems, Spencer Fitch, Susan Choi, Nellie Reifler, Ravi Howard, and others. Each chapter of the book focusing on a lesser-known, neglected waterfront space, Dead Horse Bay, where the pre-automobile city's legions of horses once met their maker, Hart Island, New York City's still active Potter's Field, where over 800,000 New Yorkers, unclaimed dead in New York, are laid to rest, Sandy ground, one of the earliest free black communities in the nation, made prospering through oystering and strawberry farming, etc. The result, as the Penn Faulkner award-winning writer Kate Christensen says, is, quote, a beautiful, haunting portrayal in writing, art, and photography of the history and culture of the waterways of New York City, the industrially polluted creeks of the present, the colorful, isolated beachside communities of the past, the ravages of encroaching sea levels, and the beauty of urban beaches, a hidden world in plain view. As Jennifer Egan, the Pulitzer-winning author, notes, the book is a, quote, lush, inspired reminder that New York's waterways were once its lifeblood. And as Eric Sanderson, author of Manhattan adds, it is a reminder that in this early 20th century city, so focused on growth despite the threats of climate change, the consequences for better or worse, we often forget how the city leaves places and people behind. So with that broad span of history and that introduction, I think we can turn things over to our speakers tonight. We're gonna have conversation until about 7:30 or so, and then we will turn it over to questions from the audience. So please, as you're listening, think about questions we might pose our speakers, and join me in welcoming them tonight.
Shall I try? Oh, how does that sound? Okay. Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you to CUNY Graduate Center and the Gotham Center for New York History, and thank you to Kurt Schlichting for writing this, this marvelous book. It is so packed with material that it was hard for me to narrow it down to a few discussion points tonight, so you'll have to read it and find out the rest. Before we begin, I just want to start with a quick personal anecdote. This book means particularly personal things to me because I grew up driving down the West Side Highway to visit my grandma on Horatio Street, and it was the late 60s and early 70s, and the waterfront was just this kind of ghostly landscape of pilings and empty piers, and I just was fascinated by it, and I wondered and wondered about it. And I really think that it wasn't until reading this book that I got a full, satisfying story of the backstory, the front story, the fore and aft story, and so I just wanted to acknowledge that. Okay, so let's begin. I'm going to start with this map. And Waterfront Manhattan begins by discussing the ingredients needed for a thriving and prosperous seaport, starting with a sheltered and deep harbor, minimal tidal fluctuation, which I had no idea, and other advantageous geographical attributes. You make it clear, however, that for the port to flourish, you really need more than amazing geographical gifts. It needed a complex maritime infrastructure along with considerable human drive and ambition. I was fascinated by the early development of the Manhattan shoreline by means of water lots. Can you give us a brief tour of the harbor, of its natural qualities, and also explain the water lot system, please?
I will do that. I think I'm going to stand believe it or not, our red dot gets absorbed by the screen and you can't see the red dot. Otherwise, I'd have the red dot here. This is an early map of New York Harbor, and we're here on Manhattan Island. But the important part is that this is the entrance to New York Harbor. It's off of Sandy Hook. Today, ships move straight into the harbor, but there was a sandbar here. So the ships arriving in New York would pass very close to Sandy Hook. They'd leave that to the port side of the ship, and they'd be in what's called the lower bay. And at the time, they would anchor there in the lower bay, and it was fairly protected there. And then the ships, however, would move up, turn north, and go up through the Narrows. That's that small waterway between Staten Island and Brooklyn. And then they'd be in the Upper Bay. And the Upper Bay is the bay we see if we're standing down at the Battery, and you look south, you can see the Upper Bay. And the Upper Bay is, Long Island provides protection from most of the storms that come up in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, of course, we're going to, at some point, we'll probably talk about Sandy, and that's when everything broke down, didn't it? But the Upper Bay is a very, very protected anchorage. And so it can accommodate literally hundreds of ships. And that gave an enormous advantage to this particular port. And then another advantage is the water is relatively high right up to the shoreline of Manhattan Island. Now, if you've ever ridden on 95 and you come through New Haven, low tide, you look to your right if you're coming north on 95, and you can see an enormous mud flat. So what you had to do, what New Haven had to do, is they had to build what was called the Long Wharf. And the Long Wharf was constructed way out into New Haven Harbor so that ships had a place to tie up when it was low tide. That wasn't the case in New York Harbor. And of course, when you're starting up the East River, that's a very narrow waterway. If you stand under the Brooklyn Bridge and look across, it's a very narrow waterway, isn't it? But it's very protected. It's a very protected waterfront, and that was an enormous advantage that New York City had and the harbor had. And however, this wasn't, and as we'll talk, this wasn't preordained. New York, in the colonial world, competed with Newport, Rhode Island, Boston, Massachusetts, Portland, Maine, Philadelphia, Baltimore. All of those colonial ports competed with one another to be the leading port. And New York prevails, and we'll talk about how, in fact, that unfolded.
I'm going to go to the water lots.
Yes. So what you need in order to have a waterfront, we have to take ourselves back to colonial times. And when New York becomes a British colony, it was originally a Dutch colony, but it becomes a British colony, there's no expectation that government will do anything. In turn, the citizens were expected to, for example, build the street and maintain the street in front of their home. Well, then how do you build a waterfront? You need a pier, you need space for ships to unload. So I have a crib note here. In 1730, the city of New York received another charter. It had an original charter, and it received another charter called the Montgomery Charter. And what that charter did was it gave the city of New York the right to the underwater land 400 feet out from the shoreline around Manhattan Island. Now, in turn then, what wealthy New Yorkers who were involved in the maritime trades could do is they could go to the Common Council and they could petition for what was called a water lot. And they would be given a document, a deed not to the property they already owned along the shoreline, but the underwater land out for 400 feet into, at first, the East River. Now, in return for that grant, what they had to do was they had to build a waterfront street, and that street would be, in effect, a pier that ships could tie up to. In some cases, they would build a dock out into the river. They had to do that at their own expense. But in turn, they then collected the fees from the ships that arrived from across the Atlantic that were going to unload cargo, or they were going to load cargo. So for example, the fur trade was hugely important to both the Dutch and the early early English settlers. But those small ships would bring the furs down from Albany, and then they would be loaded onto a ship that was going to go back across the Atlantic. But they needed a pier to do that. Now, what happened then was, in terms of those water lots, when they built their pier, they filled in the land. So you have an original shoreline, and now you're going to have a street along out into the river, what was the river, and you're going to fill in that land. Now, what did they fill it in with? Well, garbage. As they started to build housing, as the city's population expanded, you had to dig a cellar. So you had cartloads of rubble, and that would be carted down to the river and dumped into what was going to become made land. And what it did is it extended the shoreline out into the East River first, and then into the Hudson River eventually as this continued. And what I have here is this is the culmination of this. So what you see, this is a 1776 map prepared by British cartographers. It's during the Revolution, and the British were very, very good at having good maps. Good maps of the water, but also good maps of the land itself. And this particular map is in the collection of the New York Public Library. And what they did is they scanned it. They scanned that map. And in effect, there's now a digital version of that map, which you can download. Anyone, it's in the public domain. So I downloaded that map. And if we were to zoom in, you can actually see some of the streets in Lower Manhattan. You can see Broadway, for example. And then this dark line is the New York City Planning Department's digital map of the shoreline. So here's the original, the shoreline, 1776. This is Battery Park City. Now the shoreline is 900 some odd feet out into the Hudson River. And you can see it's also out into the East River. And that's the culmination of 250 years of developing water lots. And it added over 2,000 acres of land to Manhattan Island. So the shorefront that we walk on today, 250 years ago, you would have been underwater. You'd be out in the East River, you would have been out in the Hudson River. About 20 feet at low tide, so that's quite an advantage. Do you have the other, the next one?
Yeah. So the next one is should I go with the next question? Yes. Okay.
Oh, can you show the one? Isn't there one that has? We're over on the East River.
I don't think so.
I thought you did that.
Let me try.
Okay. Yeah.
Ah, yes.
Here's an example of this in more detail. We're over on the East River. This is that 1776 map. And there was, by 1776, there had been water lots constructed. Pearl Street was the original waterfront. So those of you who go down to the financial district, you walk up Pearl Street, that literally was the boundary between land and water that Henry Hudson would have seen. Pearl Street. Here, by 1776, Water Street, here's Pearl, here's Water Street. And then this over here is a map that's available at the New York Public Library. These are the individual water lots. These multiple water lot grants were made, typically to people who were well connected politically, who were the merchants. They wanted to have a vibrant waterfront. And then you can see that here's South Street. So South Street is about here. And in this particular area from Wall Street to Maiden Lane, over time there were 149 water lot grants. And that created this waterfront. And then you can see by the middle of the 19th century, there's piers lining the East River and there's piers lining the Hudson River. But this is what you needed to have a vibrant port. Because as more and more ships came to New York Harbor to both load and unload, you needed more and more pier space. But this was done by private enterprise, not by public enterprise. And the city, this is both the colonial city and then after the revolution, the city exercised some control over the waterfront, but basically the waterfront was in private hands. So it was a privately developed waterfront. And it was through these water lot grants that took place. The New York City Municipal Archives has boxes of these grants, and there's some of them are up at the New York Historical Society.
I think that is just fascinating. And I guess that's the precursor to air rights too, right?
It is a precursor to air rights. So think about property. We all think of the property that we may own. Well, that's on the surface, isn't it? But this was property that was underwater. And then when Grand Central unfolds, it's the property that's up in the air above it, the air rights. So that it's really a three-dimensional space, isn't it? And sometimes we think about it just as the land itself. But these piers were very, very valuable.
I wonder about the 400 feet. Do you have any idea what that is, why that amount
I
of
don't know
space?
why they chose 400 feet, but that was what the Montgomery Charter specified, 400
I'm guessing
feet.
it probably has to do something with the tides and how comfortably a ship can come in.
It could have been. Now, then later on, the piers were extended out past 400 feet, but that gets a complicated part of the story.
Interesting. So, I wanted to mention that as well. So one of the major water lots that is more recent is, of course.
So you can see this is, I think, a haunting picture for all of us. And by the time the Port Authority decided to build the World Trade Center, the piers from the Battery all the way up into Greenwich Village, those piers, as Elizabeth mentioned, were abandoned. The ships were no longer coming to those piers. So to excavate the cellars for the two twin towers was going to generate hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of fill, which, by the way, was made land. So they excavated where the tower stood. That was made land, but they had to excavate. Now, what could they have done? Well, they could have loaded that onto barges and towed it out into the Atlantic Ocean and dumped it. But what they decided to do was to build this giant water lot. And the edge of it that you see, that's where the pier heads, where they were called the pier head was. So they just built a cofferdam. They dumped all the fill there, and that's going to become Battery Park City. And it's quite extensive. It was
huge.
Over 90 acres of land.
Yeah.
And then that's going to be
startling to see it empty like that.
It is. This is I forgot where I found this picture, but.
It's amazing. So I'm going to ask us to go back again in time and talk about some of the other things that made New York City the go-to pier. Can you hear me? Okay, so to talk about some of the other things that made New York City the go-to port on the East Coast and really one of the ones globally. But I was reading about something called the Black Ball Lines, and they were the first guaranteed scheduled shipping, which I found was really remarkable. I mean, before that, you waited and waited and waited until the cargo was full and you had to find a room in a boarding house and keep checking until your ship was ready to sail. But the Black Ball Line, and then they were followed by many others, began these regularly scheduled ships so you could actually plan. And could you tell us a little bit more about that?
There were a group of merchants. They were Quakers. And they decided they had ships, and the ships, as Elizabeth mentioned, they would announce that they were going to leave next Friday. Well, if the hull wasn't full of cargo, they might not leave. And so you couldn't depend upon a ship leaving at any time for anywhere. Well, what these merchants decided to do, they had 4 ships. And they said they took out an ad in a newspaper, 1817. They took out an ad and said, one of our ships will leave on a given day every month from Wall Street. That's where their pier was. And that would be regardless of the weather. And in turn, another one of our ships would leave Liverpool on a given day and sail back to New York. So the idea was that they offered scheduled departures. These are sailing ships. You couldn't guarantee when they would return, but you could in turn, think about this, if you were a merchant or you wanted to do business in Europe, you knew you could come to New York. And originally a packet ship would leave on a given day, but as Elizabeth mentioned, then there was the Red Star Line that followed and a couple of others. And so literally a ship left every week of the year from New York City and to go to Liverpool or to London or to Le Havre in France. No other port had that kind of service. And in turn, the ships coming back from Europe. Well, think about the New York newspapers. That gave the New York newspapers an up on all other newspapers in the country because they got news from Europe, commercial news, for example, they got that first. The Boston papers didn't, the Baltimore papers didn't. And these ships that you see here, they were built on the East River. The best shipyards in the country were on the East River. And these ships were built to sail across the Atlantic Ocean, the North Atlantic, in winter. And even what was even more challenging was, if any of you go to the beaches here in the summer, prevailing wind is from the west, isn't it? It's actually from the southwest. That's true across the North Atlantic. So when these ships left New York, they were sailing with the wind behind them most of the time over to Liverpool, London, or to Europe. But coming back, they were sailing what's called sailing upwind. And that's very difficult for any sailboat to do, but for a square rig ship, that was incredibly difficult. And they're doing it in the wintertime. So it's February, and you're in the North Atlantic, and there's a gale blowing, and you have to take in those sails that you see there. Men have to climb up the mast. There were little ropes hanging down from what were called the yard arms that supported the sail, and the men would reach over and grab the sail, there were lines to help them, and pull that up like this, up onto that yard arm and then tie it. And if they didn't do that, the ship might flounder. And it was an incredibly dangerous thing to do. And the men who did that were young. They often couldn't read or write. They made their mark on the ship's papers. They lived in the brothels along the East River when they got off the ships. They drank too much. They died young. It was an incredibly dangerous thing to do. And in some of the logs I read, the captain would write, last night blowing a gale, John Smith slipped off the yard arm, couldn't save him. They didn't even stop the ship. There was no way they could stop that ship and try to save that young man. He was dead. He was dead when he hit the water because they would wear wool clothing, and then they would have what was called an oilskin, which was a canvas cover soaked in oil, and that's what they would wear. And when they hit the water, many of them couldn't swim. But the Black Ball line, the captains drove these ships across the Atlantic going to Europe and then back. And they did it, and they were incredibly tough men and tough ships. And the Black Ball did that. If you were on a slow freighter, what they would often do when really bad storms came in February, they would sail south down to the Gulf Stream. Now they'd be pushed back by the Gulf Stream back to Europe, but they would be in warmer water, not the packet ships. They drove them back and forth. But that then made New York the leading port in the country.
Those descriptions, they remind me of Melville, you know.
They do.
Those really vivid. I don't know what those people were made of. I mean, they're very tough.
I don't either.
So I am familiar with New York's rise to power and prosperity as a result of the bustling harbor trade and also, of course, the Erie Canal under DeWitt Clinton's governorship. But what I didn't realize was just how much of the wealth came from cotton, of all of the different things, all the different goods that were flowing through. In the book describes this incredibly complex financing system. So it seems that, am I correct to understand that New York City, in a way, remotely controlled the plantations of the South through financing and consignment? And if that is the case, can you explain how this worked in conjunction with the southern ports and with the Midwest, as well as with Liverpool and England's textile mills? So the whole cotton thing and how New York sort of ruled over that.
Well, the Industrial Revolution begins in England. And that Industrial Revolution is focused on the production of iron and eventually steel, but it was in the production of clothing. And the product that they used was cotton. And for certainly the entire 19th century, this economy's most valuable product was cotton. I mean, we all think about the hardy people who went out to the Midwest and became grain farmers and then shipped their grain down through the Erie Canal and down to New York Harbor, where it was loaded onto ships and sent to Europe. That's all true. But what was most important, what was most valuable was cotton. And this becomes particularly the case with the Louisiana Purchase and the expulsion of the Native American Indians to the far side of the Mississippi River. Andrew Jackson did that. That opened up Arkansas, Louisiana, and Alabama. It opened that land up for development. And what happens is then it becomes really the heart of the cotton empire is in those three states. Now, if you think about it, that required a lot of capital. You needed money to do that. You had to buy the land. You had to purchase the slaves, often from the first the seacoast southern states, where slavery and the slave-based economy was faltering to some degree. And so the slaves themselves were what was sold, and it was sold down the river. Hundreds of thousands of slaves were purchased in Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas, and then they were taken and brought down to Alabama, Arkansas, and Arkansas, and Louisiana for the new cotton plantations. The capital for that came often from the New York merchant banks. And the New York merchant banks had made money in this global trade. And the most important waterway or water route in the world was from New York to Liverpool. Because from Liverpool, the cotton then would go to Manchester and Birmingham, where the cotton mills and the cotton machinery had been developed, but it created an insatiable demand for cotton. And a lot of it was financed by the New York merchant banks. In many cases, the ships that went, for example, to Savannah or to particularly New Orleans, often they were owned by the New York merchants. they'd send the ships down to New Orleans, they'd load them with cotton, and they'd sail across to Liverpool. But much of the cotton, a major share of it, was first put on what were called southern packet ships. So there were packet ship lines that had been started sailing between New York and Savannah, New York and Charleston, New York and New Orleans. And so the cotton would come on the, in effect, the coastal packet ships from those ports. It would come up to the New York waterfront. They'd unload the cotton bales, and they'd load them onto the packet ships going to Liverpool. The New York banks and the New York banks provided insurance. First of all, they insured the slaves, and they insured the cotton. And what they developed was an international system of trade in the 19th century that depended upon credit. And what was interesting is many of the Quaker merchants in New York, there were Quaker merchants in Liverpool, and I think they trusted one another. And they had these papers that were called bills of exchange, so that it would say 50 cotton bales were purchased from a plantation in Alabama, and then that bill of exchange became legal tender, and that would go across to Liverpool, and in turn, eventually, money would flow back first to New York, and then in turn, the plantations needed financing for the entire year, and they were paid once. Once their cotton crop had been sold in Liverpool, then the New York merchant banks balanced the books, all the money that they had advanced to the plantation, and they settled accounts. So New York was in the center of that, and there was a cotton exchange in New York City itself. But the basis of this was slavery. Karl Marx said everything, but what he did say was, without cotton, there's no industrial revolution, and without slavery, there's no cotton. And he was right.
You know, growing up in New York, I don't know why this, well, I do know why this is, but I really was not taught about New York City's role in Southern slavery, in the slave trade. It was almost like, well, we're in the North,
That's
exactly right? And so I was really surprised that I hadn't known this, you know.
There was a New York, there was a New York historian by the name of Albro, and he wrote a book, The Rise of the Port of New York, and one chapter is enslaving the cotton ports. And the Southerners, it drove the Southerners crazy. They would write about it. Their newspapers would scream about the Yankees taking all of their wealth because they sold their cotton, but a lot of the value of the cotton went to pay for the shipping, pay for the insurance, pay for the financing of the plantations themselves. And then in the run-up to the Civil War, the South thought that the British would recognize their independence because of its dependence on cotton. And what happens is there's was called the cotton famine in England during the Civil War, and the British government actually started a relief program to provide relief for the cotton workers who worked in the mills because there was a shortage of cotton. It was an integral part of the rise of New York. And I agree with Elizabeth. We don't like to think about that, right? We like to think about the evil of slavery as a uniquely Southern problem. Well, look at some of the merchant banks. The records of part of the records of the Brown Brothers, which is now Brown Brothers Harriman, those records are at the New York Public Library, and they've digitized them. So you can go and look at the account books for a particular plantation and look at the amount of money that was advanced to them year after year after year after year. And then, of course, that was settled when the cotton was sold in Liverpool.
Yes. So let's switch a little bit and talk about the dock workers in New York and their circumstances. Now that much of New York's waterfront is green space and upscale real estate, it's hard to imagine the squalid conditions of those who worked and lived in the areas adjacent and along the shoreline, especially in the 1800s and early 1900s, which was then exacerbated by the enormous waves of immigration coming, people arriving here at a city that really did not have the services or the social infrastructure set up to receive the enormous amount of people. And so it's not just, obviously, not just the dock workers that were struggling, but that whole labor force lived in these tenements, miserable tenements along the, let's see. There we go. Along the waterfront, and they were poorly paid and taken advantage of by greedy landlords. There were no laws of rent control or no housing codes, et cetera. But I'm familiar with Jacob Riis's descriptions of tenement life. But you write about the Pulling Report, which predates Riis.
Yes.
Can you describe Pulling's findings and say a word or two about the so-called sanitary wards?
I will. To have a vibrant port, ships came and went at all different times of the month, all different times of the year. And what you needed then was you needed a day labor force. People who worked on a daily basis, so that when a ship arrived, beginning there would be the call all longshoremen, and the men who worked the docks would go to a particular dock, a ship would be there, and they'd look for a day's labor loading or unloading the ship. And these, we eventually called them the longshoremen. But it was also people who brought the carts to the docks to haul the material away or brought the cotton to the docks to be loaded. So a huge labor force was needed for the Port of New York to flourish. And the immigrants provided that labor. Now, this is later on, but this was what often happened. You had what was called the shape-up. So a ship arrived, or a ship was going to be loaded, and the men would leave the bars along the rivers, and they'd go to the dock looking to be hired. And the stevedore, the head stevedore would come out and say, you, and you had then a couple of days' work loading or unloading that ship. But there were always more men than there was jobs to be had. And it was a terrible way of organizing labor. Imagine the work that we do today. If I went to class and, the dean said, well, 3 of you, who wants to give this lecture today? Yeah, right. And then, and I would wink at the dean and say, gee, on my next paycheck.
Slip him a...
But it was, and eventually organized crime takes this over. So this was a very, very difficult way to earn a living. And this is from the famous movie On the Waterfront. And this is where Marlon Brando's assaulted by the mobsters. And this, by the way, was filmed in Jersey City. But this was not, it wasn't just a tough life on the piers. They had to live on the waterfront because they couldn't afford to take the street trolleys, which eventually move across the streets in the city. They had to live in the waterfront neighborhoods, and they were the worst of the slums in the city, and it's unimaginable for us. And what Elizabeth mentioned is that before Jacob Riis, there were concerned citizens. And there was an organization, a philanthropic organization called the Citizens Association. And this was wealthy New Yorkers. And they were campaigning for serious change. And what they wanted to do was to document the lives of the people living in the tenements along the rivers. So what they did is, first of all, they were also advocating for the state of New York to set up a Department of Hygiene that was independent of Tammany Hall. And while that was, this is during the Civil War, while they're doing that, they decide to commission their own survey of life in the tenements. And what they did is they divided the city up into 26, what they called sanitary districts, and they'd hired a team of people to study the housing in each of those sanitary districts, and each team was led by a physician. And Pulling was the one who looked at what was called the fourth ward, and that was the below the Brooklyn Bridge going down to the East River. That was some of the worst of the worst. Now, we're familiar with the 5 Points, aren't we? Tyler Anbinder, Scorsese, but the Fourth Ward was as bad, if not worse, than the 5 Points. And on Cherry Street, where the Alfred Smith houses are today, there was a tenement called Gotham Court, and Pulling went to Gotham Court. And he found this was the worst he had ever seen. This was a 5-story building that there were 2 of them. That was 100 feet long. I forgot the exact number of apartments. Each apartment had 2 rooms. The toilets were in the cellar. There was no running water. And Pulling found that over a 2-year period of time, I forget the exact dates, the infant mortality rate in the building was 22%. 22% of the children born to the women who lived there, and many of them, I found them in the 1880 census, the men worked on the docks. Mm-hmm. And the 1880 census also asked if a person had been, injured. And so in the 1880 census, you can read that a longshoreman was down in the ship and the cargo broke loose and it broke his arm and he couldn't work for 3 months. And he would have been the only source of income, perhaps, in that family living in a 2-room tenement in Gotham Court. And Riss wrote about Gotham Court as well. Charles Dickens, who famously came to the country and toured the 5 Points, he went down to the 4th Ward, he went to Gotham Court, and he wrote it was worse than anything he had ever seen in the worst slums in England.
That's pretty
was this
bad.
one building, and it was just one building. There were more bars per person than there were stores, grocery stores.
I found that very interesting, that there was a real shortage of proper food available for people. It was one store for a great deal of 27 families or something, I think you said, and which would often sell rotten food at really extortionary prices. There was no, I hate to say this, but that still exists to a degree, not quite as bad, but it reminded me of things I've seen.
I think many of these people were desperate. They came to America looking for a better life, and famine Irish, mm-hmm. and they lived on the docks, and they stayed there for a long period of time. So if you remember in the not the gangs of New York, if you remember in On the Waterfront, how many of the men have an Irish name, or they speak with a brogue? And it's just it's a caricature, but it was real. It was an Irish waterfront for a long period of time. And Carl Malden plays Father Barry. I'm looking for some nods. Remember Father Barry?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you,
Okay,
there's this wonderful passage in your book about the real story behind On the Waterfront, and it's based on a series of articles by Malcolm Johnson for the New York Sun. And that actually the priest that Malden plays, he's so wonderful, Father Barry, is based on a real person named Father Corridon, who was kind of a crusader in a way.
He was a Jesuit, and there was a movement for reform, and it was certainly true in the Catholic Church. There was the Catholic Workers movement. And there were a group of Jesuits who come of age, and they were influenced by Dorothy Day. They were influenced by a series of encyclicals that the popes wrote about the dignity of labor. And so rather than teach, they saw their mission as helping the people living on the docks. And Corridon got to know the people. He walked the docks, he ministered to them, and he becomes the source for Malcolm Johnson's Pulitzer Prize-winning stories in the New York Sun that Elizabeth mentioned. And then when Elie Kazan is going to do the movie On the Waterfront, the screenwriter is Bud Schulberg. And Bud Schulberg won the Academy Award for his screenplay, and his source was Corridon. And Corridon was also Malcolm Johnson's source. And in fact, the Jesuits had a labor institute at Xavier High School. So many of you know Xavier High School. And imagine it was a kind of a continuing ed, but the idea was during the Depression, part of the New Deal, there were new labor laws. And they took that seriously, and they thought that they could work with some of the longshoremen who wanted reform, and that's what they saw their mission as. What happens, however, is Corridon was really rattling the cage, and he's rattling the cage of the powers that be on the waterfront, the Longshoremen's Association, and some of the big shipping magnates. And he rattles the cage so much that they go back to, many of them were Catholic, and they contributed to the archdiocese, and they go to the archdiocese and said, you got to get rid of this Corridon. He's really causing trouble on the docks. And they get to the Jesuits, and Corridon leaves for Lemoyne College after the movie. And after the reform, the Dock Commission is formed in '54, and that really does change the waterfront for the better. But it is a really interesting story because there's Carl Malden, and that's really Pete. They called him Pete Corridon. He was a Jesuit. Born here in New York.
He was my favorite character in that movie.
Yes.
It was so beautifully played. So the Department of Docks took over and things improved, but it was a little late because, well, you said that 2 years later, so this was '54, right? So in 1956, there was an article in the New York Times, but buried deep in the Times, Kurt writes, that mentioned something about these lovely silver metal boxes filled with cargo, and wasn't that an interesting new technology? So maybe you would like to talk about this.
Yeah, let me just mention what we were just mentioned about the fact that privately owned waterfront worked until the run-up to the American Civil War, because there was a revolution in shipping, and the ships got much bigger, longer, because they were now steam-powered. And so you needed longer docks. And the shipping companies were furious about how bad the conditions were on the New York waterfront. And so in 1870, the city and state of New York set up a new department in the city government called the Department of Docks. And the idea was to bring reform, to build longer piers, and I'll just mention that, but just to make the waterfront more efficient. So what the Department of Docks began to do was to buy back the waterfront. They went to the private owners of those water lots and they bought the shoreline. They bought that back. And then they needed longer piers. So what they thought they could do is they could extend the piers, for example, out into the Hudson River. Well, by this time, the federal government had really taken over control of America's navigable waterways. And so you had to go to the Army Corps of Engineers for permission to build longer piers out into the Hudson River. And the Army Corps of Engineers said no. Well, the New Jersey people didn't want them to do it, and that's another story. So what did they do? They needed piers that were going to be 600 or 700 feet long as opposed to 300 feet. So what they did is they went into Greenwich Village, and if you think of Gonsworth Street down to Christopher Street, they bought back not just the waterfront, they bought back almost 2 city blocks. They bought it back. They tore down all the buildings. Then they excavated the shoreline and brought the shoreline back to West Street. There used to be 13th Avenue.
That's so strange.
That avenue has basically disappeared, but the shoreline was out to 13th Avenue, and then they built some modern piers. And by the way, the Department of Docks was profitable because shipping was still so important to the city that when ships came, they paid a hefty fee to dock. And these now are by this time, it's the large British passenger ships that are coming. The Cunard line are coming. And they do that in Greenwich Village, and then they go up into Chelsea, and they do the same thing a second time, and they build the Chelsea piers. And they were almost 900 feet long. And by the way, that's where the Titanic would have come.
Wow.
It would have come to the Chelsea piers. I forgot which pier, but it would have come to that pier. So all of that takes place. But what Elizabeth is alluding to is that we're in the post-World War II period, and there's a shipping executive, Malcolm McLean, and he was both in shipping and trucking. And he just got fed up with the corruption on the docks. The mob controlled the docks by that particular period of time. They stole everything that wasn't nailed down. They had what were called public loaders. These weren't the men who loaded or unloaded the ship. So if you drove your truck to the pier to pick up cargo, you had to hire one of these public loaders who often was a hoodlum. And the president of the Longshoremen's Association once said, well, they asked him, well, why do you hire all these men who have been in Sing Sing? And he said, well, everybody deserves a second chance. And they just shook down. If you had to pay a bribe to get your truck on the dock. You had to pay a bribe to get it loaded. You had to pay these men to load it. And then you probably paid another bribe to get the pier off the dock, the truck off the dock. So what Malcolm McLean did is he had a cargo ship which he ran from Newark to Houston. And he was tired of then sending his trucks down. So he said, well, look, I'll have someone build an aluminum box. I'll put my cargo in that box. I'll load it onto one of my war surplus ships, and I'll send that down to Houston, and that becomes the container. And that container really was a technological revolution. I mean, it's a container. We all have seen them, but it revolutionized shipping, and it really destroyed the world of certainly the Manhattan waterfront. First of all, how could you get a container to one of the piers on the Hudson or East River? You couldn't. So what you needed then was a place where you could load and unload containers, and there was space available over in New Jersey, in Newark and Port Elizabeth. And so literally, the harbor, the shipping, exits Manhattan and Brooklyn and relocates to New Jersey, to the giant container port that you can see if you come up the Jersey Turnpike. And you can see Elizabeth here has these slides. These are gigantic ships with thousands and thousands of containers, and they're loaded and unloaded very quickly. They're not opened, although the longshoremen said when the containers first came, they demanded that the container be lifted off the ship, opened, they take out all the cargo or whatever was inside and put it back in. And they said, if you don't let us do this, we'll close down the port, which they did a couple of times. And the way that was solved was the shipping companies paid into a fund that guaranteed many of the longshoremen a job for life, even if they never went to the dock ever again. But the container has revolutionized certainly the harbor of New York, because it made all of those piers redundant. There was no need for those piers. And it shrunk the world, didn't it? You know, and part of what we're all arguing about today is this globalization. You know, you can have a container over in China or in Ethiopia, and that container can be loaded on a ship, come across the Atlantic for peanuts per pound, and you can unload it over in Port Newark. And the Panama Canal's been widened, and now these huge container ships can come through the Panama Canal.
Is that also the reason that the Bayonne Bridge has been several times raised?
So for the port to function, they had to first dredge the channel from the upper bay into Newark Bay. They did that, but that wasn't enough. So what they did is they raised the roadway on the Bayonne Bridge, and now this next generation of super container ships can come into Port Newark. And I guess the expectation was that the ships would leave from China, for example, and not go to the west coast of the United States. They'd come through the Panama Canal and come to New York. But it's a huge, and it's really shrunk the world. It really has. But then it made that waterfront that was there for 200 and some odd years, it made it redundant. There's one study thought that there were about 50,000 longshoremen around the 1950s. Over in Port Newark, they do an annual report, and they've got like 2,500 or 3,000 people who would be the equivalent of a longshoreman. It's all mechanized. And so a way of life just disappears. And that's then Elizabeth is talking about coming down. I mean, many of you in this room must remember what it was like to walk over on West Street, you know, with the falling down elevated highway and the rotten piers. It was terrifying.
And speaking of which, so we can move to this terrible decline, which really changed New York City, and it coincided with, I mean, I don't think it was the sole cause, but it was one of the great causes of New York City really falling apart in the 70s. But amazingly, it, you know, somehow revitalized. And so I'd like to talk a little, or I'd like, if you would, talk a little bit about the revitalization. And so now, instead of money being made by shipping, money is being made by real estate, right? And the High Line is a little bit of I guess it's kind of a symbol of the whole revitalization. Yes. And but it's one of many projects that's going on. And what do you think are the root causes of the, you know, the Phoenix-like rebirth of the New York City waterfront? Is it just real estate, or it must have been a shift of
I think it's
perspective?
There was a complicated set of reasons why the city, it was the near death of New York. I remember this. I was in graduate school at NYU in the early 70s. I lived on East 10th Street. It was terrifying to go from class or from the campus at night over to East 10th Street. And if any of you remember Tompkins Square, with the street people were living in the square, and the buildings in the East Village were abandoned, and the squatters were in those buildings, and crime was a daily occurrence, wasn't it? And there was this sense of decline, and the city almost went bankrupt. And it didn't, and it did rebound, and part of it was to reimagine the shoreline, to reimagine that space, because it was no longer going to be for shipping. And the High Line, the High Line itself is a complicated story. That was built by the New York Central Railroad. It opened in 1929, but it also became a symbol. But there's another piece to this. New York was not just a shipping center, it was also a center of manufacturing, and we forget that. There were thousands of small manufacturing firms on Manhattan Island and in Brooklyn, and they employed tens of thousands of people. Gentleman over here was talking to me about your grandfather had a steel business on 33rd Street? 30th Street, he had a steel business. And that disappears because you now need factories that are going to be one floor, and they're going to be lots of space. So when the city is at its worst, you can begin to reimagine the shoreline. And the Friends of the High Line did that. There was talk of tearing down that hulking wreck, and it was really private imagination that rescued the High Line. And it has become the most popular tourist attraction in New York. The last time I was up there, I'm walking like this.
I know, it's become
there were so
impossible.
many people, and Elizabeth and I were talking about this.
Mm-hmm.
But think about how much real estate redevelopment that's generated.
The meatpacking district
And the
alone is just
meatpacking district.
I mean, that's felt like it happened overnight.
And it's the dilemma is it's an upscale waterfront, isn't it? Mm. It's upscale. The meatpacking district. The last time I went there, I don't know, a beer was $14, and I thought I had fell in the rabbit hole. But what it has done is it's attracted people. And this, by the way, has been this very complicated public-private partnership that has done this. The Friends of the High Line are not a New York City agency. They're a private, not-for-profit organization that were able to imagine this hulk and bring that to obviously a successful conclusion. The same thing is true of the Hudson River Park Trust, Battery Park City. Well, those are what are called authorities. They're not private organizations, they're not public organizations. They're a creation of the state of New York, creates these authorities, but they've been wildly successful, haven't they?
Are they all state, the authorities?
They're state, you need state legislation to establish them. I was coming down here tonight, and I walked through Bryant Park, and it's filled with people. It looks like beautiful, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And that's the Bryant Park Corporation, which is a not-for-profit corporation. But I can remember Bryant Park. You wouldn't go in there at noontime with a police officer because the junkies just controlled the park. Mm-hmm. And we've had this private-public partnership, which I think on one level has made New York what it is today. Central Park, for example.
It's interesting, though. I mean, I think about the Parks Department, and most of the parks that we know of are actually not, they have their own trust or their own conservancy or their own entity. And I wonder about how that works.
Well, it's the Brooklyn Bridge Park is the same thing. Now, those parks have to have a source of revenue. In the case of the Hudson River Park, their major source of revenue was Pier 40. One of their major sources of revenue was Pier 40, the parking garage in Pier 40. Well, that needs $100 million of repair. Pier 40 needs to be, the supporting pylons have to be replaced. And the estimate is $100 million. Well, how do you do that? You find a real estate company that owns the old terminal across the street, which was the southern terminus of the High Line. It's a 4-story concrete building. I think American Express uses it. Real estate company buys that,
someone say that.
And then the park trust says, well, we have air rights over Pier 40. We'll transfer you those air rights, and then you'll build these 5, 6, 7 multi-story, high-end buildings, and that's the trade-off.
Now that has not broken ground yet,
It
right?
hasn't,
But
no.
but I wonder, did they get a rotten deal? You know, I mean, because they got $100 million to restore their pier, but that seems like peanuts for a huge development.
But that's what we're doing. The same thing happened at South Street Seaport. You know, the seaport was destroyed in Sandy, and the company that's rebuilding the seaport is building a high-rise condominium across the street. Same thing's happening up at Grand Central. The new building going up next door is going to be 80 stories high when the zoning is 60 or something like that. What does the city get? It gets an entrance to the east side access. So you trade that off, and so the picture there is Hudson River Park, but also that was the plan by Barry Diller and his wife Diane Van Furstenberg to build an island out in the water off of Pier 55. And it would be for concerts and art and shows and things like that. They negotiated that with the Hudson River Park Trust, not with the local representative of Common Council. They negotiated that privately with the trust, and then it was announced that they're going to build this island, and then all hell breaks loose. All hell breaks loose.
That's off the table now, right? Yeah.
It's off the table. It's back on the table. It's off the table. Sorry?
It's not the same way.
Okay, I
Okay.
see. Wow.
So here's a perfect example of this, how this conflict ended. So if you've been over to the Brooklyn Bridge Park, it's beautiful, isn't it? And there's a recreation pier, and the pier has lots of, you play soccer, tennis, but there's also basketball courts. And the basketball courts, as you can imagine, in a city like New York, these unbelievably good basketball players come down to play. They're not white. And then the people who see that as their park, they react, and then there's a petition to remove the basketball courts and replace them with tennis courts.
Really?
Well, so the waterfront has been revitalized, hasn't it? We've all walked there. It's so beautiful. But it's this public-private partnership, and then controversy with the Diller Island is a perfect metaphor for what can happen when you have that public-private partnership.
Also, what I think you're bringing up a really complicated problem or potential problem is that as it goes up more and more upscale, is it really available to everyone for use? Hopefully, in theory, yes, but
in theory, yes, and you walk down to the Whitney, and what's the admission fee to the Whitney?
That's right.
$30 or,
yeah.
And it is certainly that park there, that part of the Hudson River Park that you see is open to anyone. Anyone can come and walk there, and people do. But would that be true of the Diller Island?
So let's take a look let's bring all the way to now. This is the latest. We have to mention Sandy, because what the thing that was not really considered by Bloomberg in his Vision 2020 plan, which was in many ways a great plan, and a lot of those projects have been realized or are underway. They didn't anticipate the ferocity of Sandy. And so this is the latest project that is, being argued over, et cetera. And it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds. It's a combination, right, of wall, you know, a big seawall and park space and remediated wetlands and all kinds of stuff that in theory sounds amazing, but it's gotten stalled the last I read.
Well, what happens in Sandy is if you, I have a map, and you can see the surge. So the NOAA has mapped the surge, and when you look at the surge, where the water ended up, it's literally the original shoreline.
It's amazing, like almost exactly,
So
right?
all of that made land flooded. Every building in Battery Park City, water was in the basement. Along South Street, all of those buildings, the cellars flooded. Con Edison plant up on 14th Street, which used to be Stuyvesant Cove. First Avenue was where the shoreline was. It blows up. And the NYU Lagoon Center is, so what's the private owners of those buildings have done is they've been moving the mechanicals up to the second and third floor. Now you have to have a deep pocket to do that, but those buildings, there's 18 million square feet of office space that sits along that particular part of the East River. And what happens next?
Right.
What happens next?
On the other side too, with the Chelsea, all the galleries in Chelsea flooded, and now in order to be able to afford insurance, they all had to move up to the third floor, and they also, a lot of them moved to different neighborhoods, you know, and Lower East Side, et cetera, inland.
This isn't just a New York City problem. This is a problem for us.
For us.
We love being on the shoreline, don't we? Whether it's at the beach in the summertime or walking at Hudson River Park. It's just beautiful. It's a beautiful place to be. And what happens when we have not Sandy, but what about the next Sandy? And these are some plans to do that, but the price tag is enormous. There was even talk of building a Netherlands-type floodgate in the Narrows. Well, $20 billion, $30 billion to build it and $1 billion a year to maintain it. But we do have to think about this. And what I'm surprised at is that buildings still sell, and so the risk must be factored into A, the cost of the building, and B, the insurance, the private insurance.
It doesn't slow it down, though, at all.
It doesn't slow it down
amazing.
at all, does it? Yes?
To an extent, they're proceeding with what they call the big U. Right?
That's
Yes.
this, yeah.
That's what Elizabeth has up there. There's the U, you can see it.
Yeah, the U, it starts in Midtown West Side and goes down and around the Battery and up to, so it's sort of 50s and 40s on either side and down, because those are that's the lower lying land on the island.
Yes?
Going earlier in your talk, did cotton replace rum?
Rum was a part of what this is the early colonial. So for example, the colonies in the Caribbean produced sugarcane, and sugarcane was worth more than gold. So the sugarcane plantation islands, Barbados, for example, you needed to feed the slaves. So the New England shipping people sent produce down to the Barbados. They brought the sugarcane, some of the sugarcane back as molasses. When you mill the sugar cane itself, one of the byproducts obviously is sugar, but you get molasses. They brought the molasses back. Newport, Rhode Island had factories that turned the molasses into rum, because then they could sell the rum. They could use the rum to buy the slaves over in Africa. So that was part of that triangular trade.
And the phrase, the sea reclaimed its own.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, about a year after
after Sandy, I was fortunate to be at the transit museum with some of the higher ups who were witnesses to everything going on. A couple of them were watching the battery tunnel fill up. They looked at each other and said, you know, what can we do? Water's got to go somewhere. If it doesn't go in the tunnel, it goes into Wall Street.
Right.
Okay? So they made a decision on the spot. We lose the tunnel. What I'm looking at here is that, where's the water going to go? Number two, remember, Sandy was a surge event. It wasn't a hurricane.
Right.
There was no wind, and there was no heavy rain. And we had a heavier rainstorm earlier this summer where there was damage nowhere near what this was. But I drove my car right to the shoreline in Brooklyn because there was no wind.
Right.
And I saw where the water ended, and it ended at what was the natural shoreline of Brooklyn. And only Industry City was destroyed because that was all on landfill.
Well, Red Hook too, because that's where my studio is. Red Hook was flooded as well.
Well, Red Hook is another story. Red Hook is entirely landfill,
Yes.
except for where my friend lives on Coffee Street. I told him when he moved in, I said, you're going to lose that house from the first hurricane. He says, no, I'm at 20 feet. And I went down to Red Hook, and there were cars floating around the streets.
Yeah.
Nobody bothered to tell the car owners, move your goddamn car above 14 feet. 247,000 vehicles were lost in Sandy, just in the Northeast, Jersey, Connecticut, New York.
Yes.
And, you know, insurance companies had to pay off on that. And they didn't have a car to go repair their houses.
So, one of my areas of study is the consolidation of Greater New York. And one of the earliest documents for the consolidation was to unify and better manage the port, which consisted of not just Manhattan, but also Brooklyn and Staten Island and Queens. Do you speak about that? Can you speak about that?
Well, just to follow on to that, when the Port Authority was established in 1921, it was the Port Authority.
Port of New York.
Port of New York and New Jersey, and the idea there was to not just deal with the New York side of the port, but to deal with the New Jersey side as well. But the original purpose of that authority was to improve the port. And I believe in terms of the consolidation, that was true as well, because then you would have one agency, what the dock department morphs into a series of other names, but then you would have one city agency managing the piers throughout the entire port, including Staten Island.
No freight tunnel.
No freight tunnel, that's another story.
That was in the plan.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back a bit to the 70s and particularly to the because on Gansevoort Street, which is where the Whitney Museum is, there's also a very famous pier where an artist named Word Matthew Clark
Yes.
a big parabola into the back end of the wall.
It's so great. Yeah.
But he was only the first artist to begin to sort of colonize the piers. Also gay men used the piers, homeless people used the piers. So the piers had maybe not a function that they originally served, but and they were totally abandoned and very dangerous.
Very dangerous.
But it did have this very significant impact.
That's a really good
There were
point.
galleries there, there were artists, big in the David Warner Rowan show recently at the Whitney. There was a whole slideshow about an art show that came along. But can you sort of talk to maybe what role that had?
Well, the Chelsea art galleries are in buildings that were buildings where cargo would be stored. And so you had this big space, and then that space was no longer used, and I what I can remember, help me here, the first artists that went there found space they could afford.
You know, I have to jump in there because it is a strange thing how, you know, in all parts of New York City, and my guess is probably all over the place, is that artists are the ones to move into the abandoned warehouses because it's cheap. It all comes down to space.
Soho as well.
And then as soon as that gets established, then come the bars and the restaurants and then the boutiques, and then you have the developers and the artists are out again.
That's right.
So, I mean, that's the meatpacking district
That's
is
the
exactly
meatpacking
that. And Williamsburg is a very, you know, perfect example. I feel like I've been chased out of neighborhood after neighborhood for that reason. And Williamsburg, I know we don't really have time to talk about this, but that whole waterfront development that now is all those high rises that block the view for the rest of that whole area, that was a bit of a travesty, in my opinion. I think there could have been more asked back or more control. I think the community didn't have as much of a voice. And I think that's, I know I work with the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, and all along, the development along the Gowanus Canal is learning from the mistakes of the Williamsburg development. So it's interesting.
It has.
There's no symbiosis.
Mm-hmm.
That couldn't happen easily.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, it's like everyone's learning how to figure it out.
One of the things I thought you would discuss was the ferries that are now going to the River and on Jersey. Now, you have to pay for all of those. Yet the Staten Island ferry is free.
They're all private.
They're all private.
Yep.
Yeah.
Every single one of them.
The city then have to support a free system and not have to get a part of the subway system and pay to go aboard. The other thing you ought to know is all of the tunnels are 12 feet 6 or 13 feet high. So in order for these high trailers and everything and containers to go from Jersey, etc.
That's a good point. That's right. That's a good point. That is a good point.
That's part of the reason why it's Newark, because you get to I-95 right away from the port of Newark and Elizabeth, and from here you couldn't
get
trucking, you couldn't, you know, it was impossible to get through the congestion of Manhattan, et cetera.
Showing that the public library of 400 years of charting New York's harbor.
Yes.
2008. They had a chart which showed, I'm just eyeballing, that 2/3 of the upper harbor was filled in with landfills so that there could be more land to develop.
Yes.
I don't know if you saw that, and when it was and how it got to be, because developers rarely lose.
Well, it was really part of that. It was part of that expansion. One example, the railroad, the New York Central Railroad, in effect, went through Riverside Park, and then there was a plan to put that into a tunnel and extend Riverside Park to the water line, which eventually happens. But I believe it was Theodore LaGuardia says, well, no, we can't do that because we're going to need more piers. We're going to have to continue to build bigger and bigger piers all the way up along along Manhattan's west side, including up into where Riverside Park is, so that that doesn't happen. But that was part of the way people thought about the waterfront. The waterfront was a place apart. It was a place of commerce. And I have some pictures of, there were pier sheds, there were sheds out on West Street or South Street, and you couldn't walk out onto those piers. If you went to a ferry building, you could, but the piers were private spaces, and we forget that. And so the energy of Manhattan Island comes to Fifth Avenue, for example, but not the waterfront.
One more question?
What stopped building into the water was the Federal Clean Water Act, which Congress passed.
That's right.
It said it's illegal to build those things. It's illegal to build in public waterways that are navigable when you have a practical alternative on dry land.
Right.
And for New York City, the critical issue is that a lot of New York City is much higher and drier than those elevations, which in many cases are in top risk hurricane evacuation zones. So I want everyone to know that these are not a dead company. $140 billion thing that costs New York Harbor is not a dead company.
No.
It's highly controversial and fought over, and anyone who wants to oppose those things
Yeah.
Should come to the end.
The Daily News had an article about this, and it says the whole thing is stalled, and that De Blasio just asked for another $700 million, but has not disclosed as to why or what for. So.
What did she talk about? We can't hear what she said.
What was the question?
What was the question she said? The comment?
She was talking about the Clean Water Act that was that prevented us from building into the water.
Well, I think both of our guests deserve a very thorough round of applause. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you again.
Thank you.